Hello everyone, welcome back to the TJOmega channel for day 1068 of our daily content grind, and something special came up on YouTube that I thought I would give a watch and just let you know what I thought. So, someone actually took the effort to take the Japanese version of the '86 Transformers movie and subtitle it into English, which is kind of a rare thing because it started off as an English production. Why would you translate it back? Which you could say the same thing about the original cartoon. In order to see the differences between the two portrayals of the story, which do have some extremely different significances that I would like to point out here. Now, before we begin, I will mention that the actual translation work was done by Karyudo fan subs, but for legal reasons, I do not support any kind of piracy or distribution of the original '86 Transformers movie outside of its official releases. Please go pay for the official release and ignore the fact that it's currently free available on YouTube from Karyudo Studios, that's 2U's, who I do not support, for legal reasons. Point being, we can actually see the differences between the two versions of the movie now, which is actually kind of special. So I'm just going to go through my observations as I watched. Some of it's going to be sequential, but we're going to start off with a whole bunch of production differences and just the things to get clear out of the way first. For starters, a lot of the dialogue is very much the same. So you do realize that this is English translated into Japanese and then retranslated back into English. The languages are not one-to-one. This is something that I think a lot of people who complain about fan subs do not understand. The languages are not directly compatible, so there is always going to be some level of interpretation and reworking in order to make it suit the language that it's being presented in. Meaning, yeah, some things will change, albeit by, translator intention or just requirement of the language. Things will be different. There's no way to avoid that, and there is no right or wrong. There is no correct way to do it, because it is always going to come down to the interpretation of the person doing the translation. That said, this does still seem to be, even though we're doing like a weird Google Translate game with this, it does seem to be mostly the same. And of course, the animation is immutable, so the story is pretty much intact. You can see the difference between the Japanese portrayal of the story versus the English one with the opening crawl, because you can just flat out see that it's not reading it exactly and it's reinterpreting some of the details. So it's not one-to-one, and we don't expect it to be. Other little changes, something to note if you watch this, not that I'm encouraging you to go watch, but if you do go watch it, something you're going to notice is that every now and then, you'll hear the English audio, the original dub, poke its way through. Because the Japanese version of this movie is not using a clean audio track. It's actually like just the original movie, where the language, the English language portions have either had their volume turned down, and the audio for the Japanese portrayals have been pasted over it to try and blend it out as much as possible. Every now and then, it'll peek through. The first place I noticed it was Springer pushing the catapult into place, where you can hear him say, "Come on, RC," before the Japanese version of the line kicks in. You'll hear that throughout the episode, and it's fascinating to realize that that's how it was done. In general, something about the way Japan portrays its characters is always a lot more toned down, and there's less color to the characters. So characters like Jazz and Blaster here that use a lot of slang, they do get dumbed down a lot. Their tone is far more militaristic. They're not quite as fun as they are in the original English version. And that just comes down to how Takara and the Japanese writers tend to portray their heroic characters in Transformers. More military-minded, more like structure of command kind of tone to it. So they're not quite as colorful as they were, to the detriment of some characters. Also, you're going to get a bit of a tonal whiplash with some of the voices. Starscream is not nearly as gravelly, even though he does still have some high-pitched elements to his voice. And then voices like Unicron, for instance. Unicron's voice, I think, is too high-pitched. It's deep, but it's still, like, it's not Orson Welles deep. There are characters in this movie with deeper voices than Unicron, which I think is the wrong call. So he, in particular, does sound really odd, if I'm being completely honest. Most of the voices you kind of get used to. Most of them still kind of stick to the same tone, and but the idea of like how an old man in English sounds versus like an old man in Japanese, which means Cup sounds very different from one movie to the other. Things like that will come across. The Dinobots, for whatever reason, have an extra effect added to their voice. Now, the Japanese dub of the original Transformers does go heavier on the effects. Everyone has a bit, a lot of characters have a bit of vocoder to them, but like Soundwave has an extremely harsh vocoder effect going on. And the Dinobots are even weirder because it sounds like they're muffled. It actually sounds like something is between the microphone and the voice actor's mouth. Like in my head, I'm almost imagining like a sheet of cardboard getting in the way to give them a different tone than the rest of the Transformers. It's hard to describe. I would go check it out for yourself just to hear like what I'm talking about. Not that I'm encouraging you to go watch the upload. I'm not. But the Dinobots in general are actually kind of interesting in their portrayal. They do still have like the me Grimlock, me Sludge. They still do that a bit, but overall they are portrayed smarter. Their language is actually more natural than it's done in the American version, which is again kind of weird to see. You'll also notice. There's also a few other things to notice. Dialogue has been added into a lot of the gaps in language, and most of the dialogue that's been added in is mostly for the sake of fleshing out what's going on, to better detail and describe the scenes. So, for instance, Unicron's original attack, on Lithone, it's peppered with a lot of description of what is going on. They describe the shaking, they describe, run, escape, that kind of thing. And you'll notice that throughout the movie. And a lot more taunts, I will say that. A lot more take this kind of language. And there are times where it's, just a little much sometimes. One thing in particular that they added a lot was grunts, groans, screams. We'll get to that in a bit. But for the most part, yeah, there's a lot less silence going on in the movie. I noticed a few times where they know the word, like there's something that I've even seen watching like Japanese versions of the original episodes. Because Optimus Prime is a 4-syllable word of a name, and Convoy is 2, you're going to find a lot of times where they refer to him as Commander Convoy, and that does go in with the militaristic way of displaying the Cybertron characters, but at the same time, it does feel like they're kind of filling out the gap. So, little weird translation things like that. Which I'm actually wondering, because later on, when we get into like Master Force and Victory, we're going to get into the lead hero being called Supreme Commander more often than not. And it honestly makes me wonder if it starts with the original Japanese dub of the Transformer cartoon having to call him Commander Convoy to make up the space that Optimus Prime takes up in the lip flaps. Kind of curious about that now. Now that it's like watching this kind of made me click with that. Let's get back to Lithone though, because I did mention, one of the things that's been added to the dialogue, a lot of screaming. A lot of screaming, grunts, groans. Characters in general react to what is going on a lot more than they did in the original movie. It's not always the best delivered. Sometimes it will come off really flat, like it's not really aware of how grave or like dire a situation is, but they are trying to add elements to it. Lithone's attack has a lot more screaming. It's actually more horrific in the Japanese version as a result. It's kind of terrifying. And one scream in particular that was added that I'm actually very happy about, Starscream getting vaporized. He actually screams when Galvatron shoots him, as one should when being reduced to ash. Jumping back again, Megatron's plan. We're gonna go a little bit more. We're gonna go a little bit more chronological. So, what I've gone through is just kind of like production changes in the movie and just tonal shifts. This, from here on out, we're just gonna kind of observe little changes throughout the movie as we watch. Right. So the first thing I noticed is that Megatron mentions his plan a lot better when they take the Autobot shuttle. All he says is that when we steal the shuttle, when we use the shuttle to sneak in to Autobot City, the Autobots will be vanquished forever. That doesn't really explain how they're going to be vanquished forever, but cutting off Cybertron City from the moon bases actually makes a lot more sense. Now the plan actually makes sense. Congratulations. That's a good fleshing out. This is a bad fleshing out. Yes, you are reading that correctly. So remember, the original version of this had shrapnel mentioning that the door that they're trying to eat through is a little heavy on the electrons. Translate that to Japanese, where there is no one-to-one translation of that. Now you have a Japanese translator going, well, he's conveying that it's making him sick. So now I have to convey that in Japanese to get the same point across. This is what they decided, which makes me uncomfortable. I imagine something similar to get to a car getting its oil changed. Moving on quickly. One of the things to take note on here is that the Matrix prophecy, for the most part, has been removed. Instead, they just kind of mention that a light will shine through this darkness, which can be taken as just words of hope rather than like a straight-up prophecy of the Matrix, and the chosen one of the Autobots. So, a little bit more vague, but maybe a little bit better that way. It's less cliche. It's more like optimistic, giving like one last nod of hope to the Autobots, So, there's a little less plot contrivance going on with that one. Speaking of which, one thing that I didn't like is that the religious aspect of this was completely removed. So, instead of Prime taking the Matrix out of his chest, handing it to Magnus and stating, "Until that day, till all are one," he just says, "Take this." Take this. It's possibly the biggest shift in tone I saw in this movie. I understand taking out, like, "till all are one." It's one of the few aspects of religion that Transformers media has, and it's kind of sad to see it lost because it gives you so much insight to how they work as a culture. But I understand wanting to remove that from, what Japan would have seen as a kid's movie, or, concepts like that, that might be a little bit too much. It's absurd. It's genuinely absurd. The phrase "till all are one" in the movie is continually replaced with "unite the universe as one," which is not the same message. It's more Autobot-y, I will admit, but it's not the same message, is it? On the other side, though, becoming one with the Matrix is still a thing. Now, this is canonical because Season 3 Prime does talk to Rodimus through the Matrix, so obviously we have to actually include it here. That has to be incorporated. Remember, this movie was released in, I believe, 1989 in Japan? So they knew what was coming in Season 3, they knew what they had to fill in for, so they made sure that slotted in correctly. One gag that I liked is that in the coronation scene, Starscream actually complains that the Constructicons are out of sync with each other. Not that their timing is terrible, Not that the timing of their language of their playing is terrible when Starscream's trying to be crowned, but just he's bugged because they're not playing well, which is kind of funny. Following this scene, just for anyone who might be asking, yes, Spike still swears. Funny enough, Magnus later on does not. In fact, he's actually asking the Matrix, please open, rather than cursing at it. Speaking of Magnus, here's actually a pretty significant change. This is a really significant change. He actually recognizes that Galvatron is a revived Megatron. You know, later on, yeah, it's established that at least the Decepticons know. Some Autobots seem, but they don't make a big deal out of it. And certainly, like, this is his first glance at Galvatron, and he immediately knows that it's Megatron brought back from the brink of death. That's weird. How did you know that? Whatever. It's a weird change. And it's not nearly as good as "and you'll die trying just like Megatron." It's not nearly as good of a comeback. Oh, speaking of lines, Ba Weep Grana Weep Ninny Bong is still in there, except they changed a little tiny bit, but 95% of it's still there. It's still in use. It's just, you know, same translation, same pronunciation. They try as much as they could. Speaking of, you know, if the language is intact, Wheelie doesn't rhyme. Which actually kind of makes sense. So, like, Wheelie's rhyming kind of comes from Western style of, like, songwriting and poetry, where rhymes are kind of expected, whereas Japanese music is much more about getting tone, just tone and sounding good together, and, you know, the language, Japanese language works much better for that. And their poetry is obviously more about metaphor and mental images than it is about a nice rhyming scheme. So yeah, the rhyming thing wouldn't have worked for Wheelie in Japanese. I'm glad they kind of ditched it. He's just kind of a kid character instead, which I think would have made him a lot more tolerable to Western fans, honestly. One little change here. Kranix declares himself the last Kranixian rather than the last Lithonian. So Kranix does announce himself as Kranix, and then declares that the planet was apparently named after him, or he was named after the planet. I'm not entirely sure. Which came first, the Kranix or the Lithone? Tell me in the comments below. I don't have the answer for you. One thing I loved in the Quintesson scenes, and I already love me some Quintessons, but the prosecutor has the coolest voice. Oh my god. So a lot of the voice actors kind of do their own thing, and they don't really go with the tone of the original portrayal. But this guy, whoever he was actually not only going with the original, like, cold tone of the prosecutor, but he went even further. It's creepy. The vocoder is heavier. It gives him this extremely cool voice. Go watch it just to hear this voice. Not that I am condoning this behavior. I'm not. So, let's move on. More tonal change to the voices. More voice thing, because, of course, this is a Japanese translation. Everything's going to be about what the voices did differently. Junkions do not speak in TV talk nearly as heavily. They still work in colloquialisms, and there's still a little bit of TV talk in there. It's like mostly sounds like it comes from shampoo commercials of all things. But for the most part, they're actually, again, just like Wheelie, talking a lot more normal, which means they're a lot easier to understand. Though granted, I'm also reading subtitles. That's going to make a Junkion way easier to understand. Also changed in language is the Sharkticons. One of them speaks. It's the only time. But it's good to know that at least one of them can talk. Or at least one of them used to be able to talk. I just got a kick out of the fact that Hot Rod, or Rodimus in this movie, actually apologized for knocking out all the Sharkticon's teeth in one punch. there's little bits like that in there. This is one of those like added dialogue things where they were doing their own thing to kind of flesh the characters out a little bit. He actually sounds sincere when he says it too. It's not like, oh, I'm sorry about that. It's not sarcastic in any way. When we get to the dance scene, and this has nothing to do with the difference between the American English version and the Japanese version. No, this is everything to do with the fact that little things that I noticed before in the movie but really didn't click in my head until I rewatched it again, in like trying to really pay attention for the sake of this video. I look at this scene and I see Grimlock dancing because of course he's there in Dino mode. He gets kissed. We see Slag jumping up and down in order to dance in Beast mode. And I thought, well, how does Swoop dance in Beast mode? He doesn't. He's actually transformed, which you'll know is actually really rare, you know, and he seems to be in robot mode the most out of any of the Dinobots in this movie. You know, any Dinobot in robot mode after season 2 is actually a rare sight, weirdly enough. But that also made me realize that Springer and Sludge are missing from this scene too, who apparently they didn't feel like dancing. Everyone else, even Perceptor's right in the middle of the dance circle. Let's see. A little bit of change here. Wreck-Gar is much more clear about their chances against Unicron. He's not just spouting off a commercial for the sake of rallying the troops. You know, it's much more direct. It's much more commanding. What's less commanding is the fact that the Junkions now sing. They now sing on their way to fight Unicron rather than the chant they were doing before. A couple little changes here. There's only one real change left. Honestly, the battle with Unicron plays out pretty much the same. You know, it's pretty much about the way you'd expect. So the climax of the movie's about, it doesn't really do anything weird with the dialogue or bring up anything new. The one weird thing about, remember how I mentioned that this movie is just the original version with the English muted out? Well, that's not true of the songs. The songs are still in English. So you can watch the Japanese version and still hear Stan Bush, you know? But weirdly enough, for whatever reason, because of the weird way this works, the word dare is muted out when they crash through the eye, which is very bizarre. You know, because they didn't mute it out earlier. For a second, I genuinely thought, is dare like a slur or a swear in Japan? Does it sound like a profane word in Japanese? But no. Earlier in the movie, all the mentions of the word are intact. So I don't know why it got muted here in this scene. And that's just like a weird observation. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. But that's really the last thing I can mention, outside of the fact that Unicron's final words aren't nearly as poetic. He's just in disbelief more than anything. Oh, and Unicron screams as he's being blown apart too, which I guess you would if you were getting blown apart from the inside out. You'd probably scream a few times. But that's pretty much it. Those are pretty much the observations I had about the differences. It's fascinating to see how just switching the language over can do so much difference, especially, and it's a great way of actually seeing just how different the Japanese style of Transformer storytelling is from the American, especially if you are familiar with the '86 movie. So, you know what? It's out there, and that's all I can tell you. So, yeah, it's an interesting watch. You know, if you have an hour and a half and you want to watch the movie in a different way, yeah, it's not a bad way to spend part of your evening. So, those are the observations. Go watch it for yourself. They obviously did a lot of work on the translation, and it's a great thing so that we can actually get to experience this side of the Transformer fiction that we normally don't get any kind of clues about. So, there we go. That's what I got for you today. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.